I still remember the sound that survey stake made when it punched through the bark of the oldest apple tree on my property. A sharp metallic crack that somehow sounded louder than the diesel engine idling behind it, louder than the men laughing by the truck, louder than the stranger in the pressed blue suit who stood there checking his watch like he had somewhere better to be. That tree had been planted in 1909 by my great-grandfather, long before highways, subdivisions, and fancy neighborhood entrances started swallowing every empty field around our little town in southern Ohio. And watching someone drive steel into its trunk felt less like damage to a tree and more like somebody carving their initials into a family gravestone. The man in the blue suit never even looked at the tree. He looked straight at me, held out a check with my name already printed across the top, smiled the kind of smile people practice in mirrors before board meetings, and said, "Monday, this orchard disappears, whether you sign or not." I looked down at the number. Probably more money than my family had ever seen sitting in one place, folded the check once, then again, and slowly tore it in half before dropping both pieces onto the polished toes of his expensive shoes. He stared at them for a second before looking back at me. "You're making an emotional decision," he said. "No," I answered. "I'm keeping a promise." His name was Clayton Mercer, owner of Mercer Horizon Development, the biggest land developer in 3 counties. A man who had turned old farms into rows of identical houses with decorative mailboxes and artificial ponds where kids weren't even allowed to fish. Every local newspaper called him a visionary. Around town, people called him whatever they wanted when he wasn't around. He had already bought nearly every property surrounding my 11 acres. And according to him, my orchard was the only thing standing between his newest subdivision and the community dog park he'd already promised investors. Apparently, my land had become an inconvenience. Unfortunately for him, inconvenience happened to be something my family had specialized in for over 100 years. My grandfather used to joke that the Whitmore family never started fights. We simply refused to move after somebody else started one. That afternoon, Clayton climbed back into his black SUV without another word. But before he shut the door, he looked over his shoulder and said, "You'll change your mind by Monday." I smiled and said, "You better hope I do." Sunday night was strangely peaceful. I walked every row of that orchard just before sunset, touching rough bark that had survived blizzards, droughts, tornadoes, and generations of stubborn people who believed some things shouldn't be sold simply because somebody offered enough money. My grandmother used to tell me every tree had its own memory. There, if you stood quietly long enough, you could almost hear old conversations trapped inside the leaves. I don't know if that's true, but standing there that evening, I could almost hear her voice telling me that land isn't something you own. It's something you're trusted with until the next generation is ready. Monday morning arrived with the growl of heavy equipment rolling down the gravel road before breakfast. 2 pickup trucks, a backhoe, 3 contractors wearing reflective vests, and 1 foreman carrying paperwork walked straight toward my gate as though they had rehearsed the scene. The foreman barely glanced at me before taping a bright orange notice to the fence. "Ma'am," he said, "I'd recommend stepping back. We need to clear to the fence line today." I looked at the notice for exactly 2 seconds before peeling it off and folding it into my back pocket. "You don't have a permit," I said. He shrugged. "We're working under preliminary authorization." "From who?" "You'll have to call the county." "No," I said calmly. "The county can call me." One of the younger workers looked uncomfortable. Another refused to make eye contact. They weren't bad people. They were just trying to finish another Monday job before lunch. Clayton arrived a few minutes later, wearing sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. He walked over smiling like we were old friends catching up at a barbecue. "Still time," he said. "Take the money and save yourself the headache." I looked toward the oldest apple tree, then back at him. "Touch 1 branch," I said quietly, "and you'll spend the next 10 years explaining yourself in court." He laughed hard enough that 2 of the contractors laughed with him. "She's got an antique deed," he announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, probably written with a feather pen. "Tear the trees down." The backhoe engine revved higher. The bucket lifted off the ground. For just a second, I wondered if maybe everyone else was right. Maybe history really didn't matter anymore. Maybe old promises only survived until someone richer decided otherwise. Then I remembered one sentence my grandfather repeated every harvest season. "Never argue with a man who's only read today's paperwork when your family has been reading the same document for 100 years. I climbed into my pickup without another word, ignored Clayton calling after me, and drove straight toward the county archives, because there was one piece of paper almost nobody alive remembered, except my family, and if it was still where my grandfather said it would be, Everything Clayton Mercer believed he owned was about to become a whole lot more complicated. The county archives sat inside an old brick courthouse that smelled like dust, floor polish, and paper that had outlived everyone who ever touched it. Most people only walked through those doors when they were buying property or settling in a state, but I had been there with my grandfather when I was 12 years old. At the time, I thought he was simply showing me old family records because he was sentimental. Standing there that Monday morning, I finally understood he had been preparing me for exactly this day. Mrs. Evelyn Harper, the deputy clerk, had worked there for nearly 40 years, and when she saw me rush through the front entrance with dirt still on my boots, she didn't ask whether something was wrong. She simply smiled and said, "Your grandfather always said you'd come looking for that book someday." Those words sent chills down my spine. She disappeared into the climate-controlled records room and returned carrying a thick leather ledger wrapped inside a faded archival cloth. She placed it carefully on the table between us, like she was setting down a family Bible. "Recorded June 17th, 1911, she said softly. "Original transfer from Samuel Whitmore." I slowly opened the brittle pages, and there it was, my great-grandfather's signature, written in dark ink that had somehow survived wars, recessions, floods, and more than a century of changing governments. Everyone focused on the property description, but my eyes went straight to the handwritten restriction tucked into the lower margin, a clause so unusual that most people would have skimmed right past it. My grandfather had made me memorize it years ago, though back then I never understood why. It wasn't just a preservation covenant protecting the orchard. It established a conditional reversion tied to 3 adjoining parcels if anyone intentionally destroyed the orchard in violation of the recorded restriction. Back in 1911, those neighboring parcels had been empty pasture owned by distant cousins. Over the decades, they had been divided, sold, merged, financed, and developed so many times that nobody seemed to remember the restriction traveled with a chain of title. Nobody except my family. "Mrs. Harper looked at me over her reading glasses. "Did somebody finally forget to read this?" she asked. I couldn't help laughing despite the knot in my stomach. "Not somebody," I replied. "A developer with $100 million ego." She smiled, closed the ledger gently, and said, "Then you'd better move quickly." I drove straight from the courthouse to my attorney's office. Daniel Foster wasn't flashy. He drove an old pickup with 200,000 miles on it, drank terrible coffee, and refused to advertise because, according to him, satisfied clients talked louder than billboards. He listened without interrupting while I spread the copies across his conference table. When he finished reading, he leaned back in his chair, took off his glasses, and let out one long whistle. "Well," he finally said, "either your great-grandfather was the most stubborn farmer in Ohio, or the smartest." We spent the next 2 hours tracing parcel numbers through decades of recorded transfers until every line pointed to the same conclusion. Clayton Mercer hadn't just bought land around my orchard. He had unknowingly built the centerpiece of his newest subdivision on parcels still burdened by a restriction he never discovered. Daniel looked at the survey maps covering his desk. "If construction begins before we record this notice, they'll argue equitable defenses. So we don't let construction begin," I answered. He grinned. "Now you're thinking like your grandfather." At exactly 9:14 Tuesday morning, Daniel recorded our legal notice with the county. Less than 15 minutes later, the first bucket of dirt came out of the construction site. Timing, as it turned out, was everything. By lunchtime, the county planning office had frozen every active permit connected to Mercer's expansion until ownership questions could be resolved. The engineering firm halted inspections. The title company suspended certifications. Lenders demanded explanations. Buyers waiting to close on new homes started calling their agents. Nobody likes uncertainty when hundreds of thousands of dollars are involved. Clayton probably expected another angry phone call from me. Instead, he got letters from banks. Around 4 that afternoon, my phone rang. "You really filed it," Clayton said without introducing himself. His confidence was still there, but I noticed something new hiding underneath it, irritation mixed with disbelief. "I told you I would." He laughed once, though it sounded forced. "It's an old restriction, ancient language. Nobody enforces these anymore." I leaned back on my porch swing and watched the evening light fall across the orchard. "Then why did your attorneys file for a variance 6 months ago?" Silence, long enough that I checked my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Finally, he asked, much more carefully, "Where did you get that?" "Public records." Another silence. "You weren't supposed to find that." "No," I corrected him. "You just bet that I never would." He hung up without saying goodbye. That was the moment I knew we had crossed from intimidation into panic. Wednesday morning, the local newspaper published a short article about permit delays at Mercer's newest subdivision. Nothing dramatic, just a few paragraphs mentioning unresolved title questions. By afternoon, every real estate office in town was talking about it. Small towns have their own internet. It's called coffee shops, diners, barber chairs, and church parking lots. By Thursday, people had invented 5 different versions of the story, each one more entertaining than the last. One rumor claimed Mercer had accidentally built homes on protected Civil War land. Another insisted Native American artifacts had been discovered under the foundations. The truth was somehow stranger than all of them. Friday changed everything. A regional news station flew a drone over the construction site. From above, you could clearly see 3 nearly completed model homes sitting inside the disputed parcels, while idle equipment remained parked along unfinished streets. That image spread across social media faster than anyone expected. Investors started asking questions. Homebuyers demanded refunds. One lender reportedly delayed funding worth over $1 million until the ownership dispute was resolved. Clayton's perfect marketing campaign had turned into free advertising for a legal nightmare. Around sunset, Daniel called me sounding almost amused. "You should probably sit down," I laughed. "I'm already sitting." Mercer's lead lender just walked away from the project. Temporarily? Banks love that word. It means indefinitely until somebody else takes the risk. I stared out across the orchard where the oldest apple tree stood exactly where it had stood for more than a century, untouched despite all the noise surrounding it. My grandmother always believed patience looked weak right before it became powerful. For the first time, I understood exactly what she meant. Saturday morning, I found Clayton standing alone beside my gate. No black SUV, no assistants, no lawyers, just him wearing jeans instead of a tailored suit, looking older than he had a week earlier. He held 2 coffees from the diner in town. "Thought maybe we could talk," he said. I accepted the coffee but didn't invite him inside. We stood there looking across the orchard in silence until he finally spoke. "You know, this project employs over 100 people. I do. If this falls apart, that won't be because of me." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You really believe your family should be able to stop progress over a document written before airplanes became common?" I smiled. "You think this is about resisting progress. It isn't. It's about keeping your word, even if you're dead when someone finally tests it." He looked down at the gravel for a long time before quietly asking, "What exactly do you want?" I looked at the oldest apple tree swaying gently in the morning breeze, then back at the man who had tried to erase it with a machine. "I don't want revenge, Clayton. I want the contract your lawyers chose not to respect, honored exactly the way it was written." His shoulders dropped just enough for me to realize he finally understood this fight had never been about money. And as he slowly nodded, neither of us noticed Daniel's truck pulling into the driveway with the folder that would transform this negotiation into something Clayton Mercer could never have imagined. Daniel set the folder on the hood of my truck without saying much, because good attorneys know that the strongest arguments are usually printed, not spoken. Clayton opened it expecting another demand letter, maybe another motion, maybe some ridiculous settlement figure he could negotiate down. But instead, he found a clean draft agreement with only a handful of pages. He flipped through them once, then a second time, slower this time, and finally looked up at me with the same expression people wear when they realize the rules they've been playing by aren't actually the rules that matter. "You're not asking for ownership of the subdivision," he said carefully. "No," I answered. "If I wanted revenge, I would have asked for that." He frowned. "Then what is this?" Daniel spoke before I could. "A 99-year ground lease." Clayton blinked. "A lease? Your homes stay where they are. Your buyers keep their houses. Your company finishes the project. But the land underneath those 3 parcels remains with her family, exactly as the recorded restriction allows." Clayton stared at the papers for another long moment before quietly asking the question I think had been haunting him ever since he realized we weren't bluffing. "How much?" I smiled, not because I enjoyed seeing him uncomfortable, but because for the first time all week he was asking the right question instead of making the wrong assumption. "You'll know when you're ready to sign." He actually laughed then. A tired laugh that sounded nothing like the confident man who had stood in my driveway days earlier promising to bury my orchard. We spent nearly 3 hours going over every paragraph, his attorney joined by speakerphone. Daniel answered every objection with recorded documents, survey maps, and county filings. There wasn't much left to argue. Clayton could spend years fighting a legal battle that investors, lenders, and homebuyers would watch unfold in public. Or he could finish a subdivision, protect everyone who had already committed their savings to those homes, and admit that somebody else's family history had beaten his timetable. Around lunchtime, he reached for the pen. Before signing, he looked directly at me and said, "You know, if you had just accepted my first offer, you'd have walked away with one big check." I nodded. "Maybe. Instead, you're choosing monthly payments for almost a century." "No," I corrected him. "I'm choosing to make sure nobody ever tries this again." He signed first. I signed second. Daniel notarized the agreement. Just like that, the fight that had consumed the entire county for a week ended with ink instead of anger. Construction resumed less than 2 weeks later, but not where Clayton originally planned. The community dog park still got built, only it ended up on another piece of land his company donated a few blocks away. Funny thing is, people actually liked the new location better because it had easier parking and wasn't squeezed against an old orchard. Sometimes the compromise everyone claims is impossible turns out to be the better idea all along, but only after somebody stops trying to force it. As for the 3 disputed parcels, every single month, without fail, a payment arrives under the terms of that ground lease. $6,800 for the privilege of using land my family nearly lost because someone believed money erased history. Friends sometimes ask what I spend that money on, expecting me to say vacations or a new truck. The truth is far less exciting. Most of it goes back into the orchard. We replace aging irrigation lines, prune the oldest trees, plant young saplings beside those that won't live forever, repair fences after winter storms, and fund a scholarship at the local high school my great-grandfather's name for students studying agriculture, surveying, or land management. I figured if one forgotten document could change so many lives, maybe helping young people understand the value of land and responsibility wasn't a bad investment either. Clayton and I still see each other from time to time around town. We nod. Sometimes we even talk for a few minutes. There's no friendship, but there isn't hatred anymore either. One afternoon, almost a year after everything settled, he admitted something that surprised me. "You know what my biggest mistake was?" he asked. I shrugged. "Thinking I could buy your land?" He shook his head. "No, thinking I understood it." That answer stayed with me because he was finally right. Land isn't measured only in acres or market value. Sometimes it's measured in birthdays celebrated beneath old trees, grandparents buried in nearby cemeteries, promises whispered across generations, and handwritten sentences tucked into dusty courthouse books that everyone assumes nobody will ever read again. Every morning I still walk through that orchard before breakfast. The oldest apple tree still carries the scar where the survey stake split its bark, and I leave it there on purpose. Some people would sand it smooth or cover it with fresh growth, but I like seeing it. It reminds me that scars don't always mark defeat. Sometimes they mark the exact place where someone stopped history from being erased. So now I'd like to hear what you think. If you had been standing where I stood that morning, would you have taken the money and walked away? Or would you have risked everything to protect a promise made more than 100 years earlier? And do you think Clayton deserved a second chance once he admitted he was wrong? Or should he have paid an even higher price for trying to force someone off their family land? Share your thoughts down in the comments, because stories like this never have just one side. And some of the best conversations happen when people see justice a little differently. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because around here, we tell the kinds of small-town stories that remind us the oldest piece of paper in the courthouse can still be stronger than the newest pile of money on the table.